Look, I mean, the problem with these shows is that I feel like with every passing episode, I'm more and more nervous about how we start the thing.
Oh, yeah?
Do you feel that?
Yeah, there is some pressure to have a pretty impressive open because we're known for that.
Right.
It's like our trademark. Speaking of which, okay, so I was in the elevator coming up to your apartment,
And
Damir.
someone said to you, are you Shadi Hamid of the Wisdom of Crowds podcast?
That would be amazing. Sadly, that did not happen. But
Sad.
instead, it was an older fellow, a white male fellow.
Mm-hmm.
And I got triggered in the elevator. He started a conversation with me, and I was triggered.
You were triggered.
And I felt like I was in an unsafe space because he asked me, can you believe what he asked me in the elevator as we were going up? He asked me, where are you from originally? He said it with a smile, but still, I was like, oh my God. And I told him.
Yeah. And you said Pennsylvania. Did you do that? That's the right answer.
It is, but I said originally Egyptian, and then he's like, "Oh yeah, well I ask everyone this because I'm from Kansas and no one cares." And then he mentioned that he had some friend who went to Egypt and studied there or something.
Did you really feel triggered?
No, I'm joking. Of course not.
Right. Well, I don't know. You know, it's a tough thing, the question of racism. I don't even know how to begin talking about it because it's people get triggered by the very subject, right?
Yeah.
It feels like a lot of stuff has been conflated into the category now. Well, again, what's on my mind is my friend and former colleague Walter Mead is in the news these days because a piece he wrote about China got headlined. I forget what it was, something along the lines of China is the sick man of Asia. It wasn't the whole title, but that was in it, right? The sick man of Asia. And the Chinese authorities in Beijing saw an opportunity. I think they're unhappy about most of the criticism they're getting about the how they're dealing with the coronavirus, and jumped really hard on this, saying that this is in fact racist. And they've managed to pick up a kind of groundswell, right, on among commentators. I mean, the story's now been picked up in the media. I think partly, places like MSNBC run it because the Wall Street Journal is on the right, so they're the enemy.
So MSNBC was criticizing the Wall Street Journal?
Well, they were reporting on the fact that the Chinese authorities were upset.
Think that this is racist.
Yeah, think this is racist. But then they were, they were interviewing, and this is where it gets interesting. They're interviewing scholars or people, commentators, and who are saying, yes, this is a racist title. Now, again, on the one hand, it is important to note that, as you know well as a writer, editors do end up picking what the title is. So on the one hand, I'm sure it's not a comfortable situation for Walter. I don't think he would have necessarily picked that title. It's, as I understand, it's not his. But at the same time, I looked it up. I looked up because there was a lot of this commentary, and sure enough, it was something that was bandied around in the 19th century. It came after the whole concept of the sick man of Europe, which was what people talked about the Ottoman Empire there. Yeah. But it really struck me how...
So sick man of Asia did have a usage in the 19th century.
It did.
And it was problematic.
Well, I mean,
I guess everything was problematic in the 19th century.
Well, so I mean, that's what it comes down to, and that's what I sort of wanted to pick your brain on, because that is the interesting thing, is that exactly as you said it, everything really is problematic in the 19th century, but the 19th century also was, how do I put it?
The golden age.
The golden age of imperialism. It's to say the conflation comes of this is that clearly colonialism was a brutal process, but is talking about or evoking something like the sick man of X, because it is a phrase that comes from the colonial period, is it necessarily racist? That's sort of the core question I have. I don't know how you think about it. I tweeted something saying, are we going to now hear from, well, not in so many words, but from Erdogan that, sick man of Europe is Turkophobic, as a phrase. Is that, and then, I'd also, there's the meta question of all of this, which is, it does feel like the Chinese authorities are really playing this up pretty skillfully. It's weaponizing wokeness.
Yep.
And it's working. So I don't know. I just throw that out for you for starters. How do you parse something like that, like the sick man of Asia? Is that
okay? So it wouldn't have occurred to me to think that a title like that was racist. I mean, now that it's been brought up, I can kind of process it and try to figure out what I think. But as is so often the case, if we're not looking for offense, we're not going to be aware of a lot of these things, but it's other people and other online mobs that start saying something's racist. Then we start wondering, wait, is it racist? Is it not? And we wouldn't have thought twice about it otherwise. I mean, the sick man phrasing, I don't think there's a good case for racism there because it's used for different regions. It's used for Europe. It's used for Asia. And you can use it for different countries. So it's not as if saying sick man of Asia necessarily is referring to China. It could also be referring to any other Asian country, including Asian countries of different races. So for example, like, I don't know, India or Pakistan, they're in Asia too, right?
But does it matter that's why I think the question of Turkey is critical. Does it matter that, European powers were struggling against the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was falling further and further behind. Everyone knew it, including the Ottomans. And it was a scornful thing to say, ultimately.
But it was also true.
So
the Ottoman Empire was becoming the sick man of Europe in its final century or two, especially its final century.
Now, again, the Chinese case is more complicated because at least the Chinese argument for this would be that, the way the European powers, colonial powers treated China was in fact, you talk about colonial rape. It's starting with the Opium Wars and how China was brought low.
But you know what? It's so absurd to me that the Chinese regime is going on about this about how this is racist when this is literally one of the worst regimes in the world, if not, in my view, the worst. I mean, what they're doing to the Uyghur Muslims is at a level of atrocity that is almost unspeakable. And, we're talking about more than 1 million Muslims being in re-education camps. We're talking about forced marriage with Chinese Communist Party officials. We're talking about trying to erase a culture, erase a religion in a way that is actually somewhat rare, at least in recent decades. I mean, this level of really quite literally trying to erase a people and their identity. So for them to then turn around and say, we're offended by racism, it's weaponized precisely as you say, because it's in bad faith. The Chinese regime doesn't care about racism.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely.
So we shouldn't indulge them. So even if, no one should, when they see Chinese Communist Party officials or Chinese media using this kind of rhetoric and weaponizing it to their advantage, no one should fall into the trap of taking it seriously. So that would be my basic position on this. Like, even if there is some kernel of legitimacy to these critiques, if you're some post-colonial scholar in a liberal arts school, I don't know, like Oberlin College or something, maybe they have an argument based on like post-colonial discourse and all that. I just don't I feel like I'm so done with woke offense. I'm so tired of it. And there was this book called American Dirt, and I literally bought a copy of it just to own the libs. I wasn't gonna buy it. I have enough books my pile by my like bedpost or whatever.
Tell me about that book, because honestly, I saw some Twitter threads on it and some mocking. What is it?
I don't know. Like the author who wrote it is like, I don't know, 1/10 ethnically diverse, but mostly a white person. And the main characters are, I guess, Hispanic, and apparently people are uncomfortable that she's speaking on behalf of people of color.
Yeah.
And she's indulging in tropes about Hispanic. I know that's the criticism or whatever, but it's been really well reviewed. And Oprah put it in her book club, and that's why it's gotten a lot of attention. But now people are freaking out about it, and she had to cancel part of her American tour. But obviously, so people are saying, oh my God, she can't even promote her book. But, I bought her book because of this. So clearly, I don't think it's going to hurt sales. I think it's actually going to help sales because it's a controversy now, right?
Right.
And I wouldn't have cared otherwise. And, I wouldn't, and I love Walter's stuff, but I don't always have a chance to read every one of his new columns. The reason that I read this new column about China, the sick man of Asia, is precisely because of the controversy that I saw around it. So that's one reason we read things we otherwise wouldn't read. So in some sense, I would like to be part of a controversy when I have a new article out, and I want the Chinese Communist Party to be pissed off at me because more people will read the article.
Right. I just want to sort of pull you back on something though. I mean, your anecdote in the elevator is a good one. Because, I wrote my little tweet and I quote tweeted this, I guess she's Chinese American author who was, again, I think very fair to Walter. She said, the article was fine, which is interesting, right? The article itself is unobjectionable, in these terms, and just points out and says that the title itself is racist, and racist is racist, she says. And so I said, I quote tweeted her and not message her, but said, basically, come on, people, you're being played. You're being played by the Chinese authorities. And she said, no, racism is racism. And I understand that the Chinese are playing this up, but that doesn't counter the fact that this is unacceptable, right? And so, it's fine to I think take this sort of meta pose about controversy and say that, all publicity is good publicity. But there's something about this kind of, I think, dogmatic stance about these things that, it's a profoundly moral stance is what it is, right? That these are moral rights and wrongs, and a moral transgression has been done here, and it must be called out. So, even if you're being played by, as you said, one of the most cynical and brutal regimes on earth, that is very clearly, to anyone who is paying attention, not at all motivated by anti-racism, put it that way. It doesn't matter, because it's important to call this out. And again, never mind that creates opportunities to be played with, but it's, do you subscribe to that? Like that sort of thing? Like is, there's so much in here. Is it that, is taking offense enough? Because again, to pull it back to the Chinese question, regime aside, as I understand it, the national pride of China is, and I mean, the regime has cultivated this certainly as a thing about not taking offense. And there is a cult of how, the Chinese nation was brought low in the 19th century. Arguably the entire, motivation for China rising up and developing itself, even, be it communist regimes, but it's always this sort of, up from our knees respect. So if that is offended, is that, what's the nexus between racism and taking offense also,
So I think that in Walter's piece, and I can perhaps say a little bit about what I think Walter was trying to get at. I think the title is a distraction from what is actually, a really important critique of China and what China has become, and specifically the Chinese regime. It's an interesting question. of to what extent we can completely separate between the regime and its population. Obviously, the two are not interchangeable. And that's why I try to go out of my way to say the Chinese regime, instead of using the kind of more broad, the Chinese did X, Y, the Chinese are bad, the Chinese are putting Muslims in education camps, because you wouldn't want to cast aspersions on an entire people. I mean, that said, from what we do know, the Chinese regime does enjoy significant support from its own people. We don't know how much, and we can never know how much, simply because it's an authoritarian regime, and they don't want people to actually know how strong or perhaps less strong that level of support is. But Walter's column is getting at something very important, that China and the Chinese regime seem very formidable from afar. We look at them and we say, here is a rising power, and they're going to keep on rising, and they're going to overtake the US in terms of GDP at some point, and various levels of economic productivity and all of that. And we're almost, as Americans, waiting for the day that we're eclipsed by this competing power. And I think there's something very short-sighted about that, because it doesn't look at regime type. That there is something about the Chinese regime that, in my view, and also I think in Walter's view, that makes it inherently brittle. Because the Chinese regime is an authoritarian regime, it's inherently, at least I would argue, illegitimate. It doesn't depend or rely on the consent of the governed. It relies ultimately on the use of coercion and force. Even if it enjoys some significant popular support, the regime isn't willing to test that through normal democratic channels. They're not willing to actually see what the people would say about the regime or about the government in a fully free environment, because they don't want to, they don't want to see what that actually looks like. So ultimately, that has negative effects on how they manage a contagion, how they manage an epidemic, a pandemic like the one that we're seeing now with coronavirus, because their incentive structure is misaligned. There's going to be a lack of transparency. They're going to be very careful about what they share in their own domestic media and what they share with the international media. And because of that level of secrecy, and because of the level of corruption that we have at different levels of the Communist Party, that people don't want to take responsibility for mistakes that are made, because the consequences can be severe. We have an environment that does not lend itself to accountability and to dealing with a crisis like this in a responsive way. So this suggests that the Chinese regime is weaker than a lot of Americans think it is.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree with that. And again, even taking a step back, as so many things seem to be up in the air and going in weird ways, it also feels to me like the United States is still ahead of pretty much anywhere in the world. I think I've said this before, but it's just, however messy things are here, like we're just doing way better. And that's to your I think your point about the resiliency of the way, and just the function of how our system is set up, the accountability that's built into it, and the sort of feedback loops that allow for self-correction.
Exactly. And just on that point, I mean, our America, if we're talking about our country, our government or our governments are inherently unstable, but our regime is inherently stable. You could say something similar about Italy when people make fun of Italy, like, oh, they're always having new governments and no confidence votes or whatever it might be. Fine, sure. Italian governments are unstable and they rotate quite a bit, and sometimes one's undermined, another takes its place. But we don't doubt, generally, we don't doubt the durability of the Italian regime as a democratic system. We trust that the Italians will find a way to muddle through, because their democracy enjoys a significant and really, I would say sufficient, probably, degree of legitimacy. No one is calling, as far as I can tell, for the overthrow of Italian regime type and proposing an alternative. Where I think that in China, you have almost the reverse, that governments might seem stable, but the regime itself is unstable in the longer term, because we don't know about succession of power. We don't know what happens after Xi Jinping what happens after him, because he's really personalized his own rule. He's become more and more authoritarian, and he's consolidated his power over different organs of the Chinese state. So what happens after him? We don't have a clear answer to that. But luckily, as Americans, we generally know what's going to happen after one president or another, because we have a system that allows for clear mechanisms for rotating and alternating power.
Well, what's interesting about the Chinese case, right, and why this is this particular episode is illustrative of maybe that fragility also, is it's recourse to this kind of rhetoric, this kind of grievance rhetoric, which again ties to a little bit to our own woke culture, but in a different way. But institutionalizing a rhetoric of grievance and making this sort of a justification for the regime. That's definitely, I think, a feature of the Chinese. But it's interesting, you're talking about European countries, and I was thinking as you were, that's, I think, one of the things that may be when people get nervous about nationalism. It's that you use a culture of grievance to legitimate yourself. You're not legitimating yourself based on the kind of performance, and you're not as certain, in the inherent legitimacy of being judged on what you achieve. So instead, you gin up this sort of stuff. Maybe that's part of what I think when people on the right certainly get nervous about, our own culture of grievance, and wokeness and the rest of this. It is that, it leads to that kind of, perhaps, it's a tool. It's a tool to be used. Not that I think the right, especially in this Trumpian moment, has much of a leg to stand on about, grievance culture, and legitimating authoritarian power. But I wonder if there's something there, that's maybe what makes a lot of people, most liberals, sort of uncomfortable about that kind of rhetoric.
Don't dismiss their grievances, Damir.
Whose? Chinese grievances?
No, the right.
I wouldn't dare. I've seen what happened to Walter. I would never dare dismiss.
MAGA country, they have real grievances, man.
No, grievances is fine. It's weaponizing the grievances. That's what I'm talking about. It's fine to have grievances. I mean, it gets a little tiresome when you're talking about, again, this current political moment and the sort of incessant critiques of Trumpism, but he is doing that. He's tapping into that sense of grievance to basically excuse almost anything else he wants to do. Right? I mean, that's one of his key things. Are you troubled by that?
Of course, I'm troubled by it, Damir. Of course, I am, and also there's some. It's remarkable that, just as like a little aside, I was thinking about this earlier today, that there's a new iteration of the so-called Muslim ban or travel ban or whatever you want to call it. And Trump added a country to it, Nigeria. Right. And it got barely any attention. And there's just so much going on. And it's just remarkable to me that even something which I think is extremely problematic and should be a national controversy only gets a blip, because I don't even know what's going on. There's too much. Wait, what's going on?
Yeah.
We had impeachment last week, which I didn't care about for reasons that we've talked about in previous episodes.
That's right.
Wait, what was the other big story?
State of the Union.
Oh yeah. Oh my God. In Iowa and
the Iowa scandal. Yeah. And then his prayer breakfast speech also apparently.
Yeah. And some people are saying that this was one of Trump's most successful weeks, that he really came into his own, if you will.
Right. He really became president.
This was the week that Donald Trump became president.
First, he lobbed those tomahawks into Syria, and then now this. Those are the 2 moments of him becoming a president.
Oh man, yeah. So, okay, what were we talking about? No, but you were making a point about grievances and how they're
culture.
weaponized.
Yeah, weaponizing that.
And I think but the left does it too. We have grievances and we weaponize them. Everyone's trying to find ways to do that.
Right. So look, I guess let me push on that a little bit, because that's maybe I'm going to make sense by the end of this episode about what bothered me about all of this and about racism.
I think that I think you're getting to something, but yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So look, it's the fact that I sincerely believe that one oughtn't be careless and antagonize people needlessly, right? That to me seems like a no-brainer. You know, you shouldn't write stuff that you know is calculated to offend, right? That's bad.
Wait, I mean, is it? I mean,
well, look, within reason. I mean, unless you have a specific point for why you're doing it, you shouldn't do it just to get a rise out of people. I mean, I guess what you're saying about as a promotion thing, I mean, I'm not uncomfortable about it, but you know what I mean? Again, what it gets down to this is okay. A former colleague at the magazine once talked about trigger warnings. You know, we were having a debate in the magazine about trigger warnings, and all of us were like, "Oh my God, snowflakes, blah blah blah, trigger warnings. How are the kids growing up these days?" And you know, this colleague of mine, he said, you know, there's a better way to think about it. It's just called manners. We used to have this sort of like or kindness and or just social.
Sure, but look, that's different though, and
well,
okay.
You know, again, the reason I bring it up is because the flip side of it is that everything becomes racist. You know, colonialism entails clearly barbarous behavior towards another people. Therefore, invoking a sentence that was used during colonial times is necessarily racist. That to me there's a leap there that gets at this, you know, this kind of grievance culture, that I think is troubling because it creates this opportunity for everyone to weaponize grievance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's what makes me uncomfortable about all of this. It's like defining racism down. Or up, I don't know which way, but you know what I mean? Like not that everything's racist, but so much can now potentially be racist that we're not really talking about racism anymore. You know, I think using, perhaps an unfortunate phrase from the 19th century as clever shorthand for something. And this is, I'm talking to and about people, not who are, not the Chinese authorities, who are clearly playing a cynical game. I'm happy to bracket that more than happy to talk about it. It's more about people who are legitimately offended by this. And I'm trying to parse the legitimacy of that offense.
I'm sorry, they should get over themselves.
Yeah, right.
No, look, okay. When I'm writing something, my goal in my writing is it's never meant, I don't write a piece thinking I want to piss people off. However, I do write pieces where I think to myself, when this comes out, some people will be offended as a kind of byproduct of me writing it. And I don't have a problem with that. And I think that's a little bit different than what you had said earlier, but it's still sort of in this category of how do we feel about things that we know will offend people. And I think that my starting point or premise is that everything I write, I believe. Otherwise, I wouldn't write it, because writing to me is personal. It's meaningful. It's kind of what I do, and I draw purpose from it. So I can't apologize for something I believe to be true, even if it has indirectly or even directly offended someone. And as long as I feel like I was justified, and that obviously sometimes you're wrong, and maybe I can go back and be like, okay, I actually made a mistake and there was an error here, or I really shouldn't have phrased something a certain way. But I think that I'm careful about words because, words are my livelihood. So it's actually, so if people come out of it thinking, oh, this is offensive, usually my feeling is going to be, well, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but I'm not sorry that I feel the way that I feel and that I write what I write. And I'm not going to start. The danger when we make concessions to readers who are easily offended is we make it about their feelings instead of what we believe to be true or what is meaningful to us as writers or as authors, right?
Right.
And I think that's a dangerous path to embark on as a writer, because then you start to lose faith in your own sense of what's important to you and what you're right. You don't want to, it's just not a good look, I don't think.
Right. So that's another deleterious effect of this thing that's happening. But you said something there that I think, I found helpful. And it's the sense that I think what's happening is that a sense of being personally wronged is now then somehow catapulted into a more universal evil. Like I am hurt by what you said, and then it's very easy to jump from that to you're a racist. Now, again, I need to be pretty careful about this because I'm talking about something very specific. I think it's not that I'm denying the existence of racism or hate, or even hate speech, even though that's not a great word. But it's the fact that there's now a leap between personal offense and moral right and wrong that I think that's somehow been compressed in a way that is unfortunate,
because we've lost religion.
Yeah, no,
it goes back. I think we talked about this. I don't know when it was, like episode 5 or 6 or whatever. But you know how I feel about this, that in the vacuum where religion, or in this specific case, Christianity, once was in American public life, something else needs to take its place and fill the vacuum and give people meaning where meaning once was. And we're finding ways to mimic the certainty and conviction of religion without the actual substantive content of religion.
Yeah.
But I don't see how it can be otherwise, because, and I think that I maybe believe this a little bit more than you, Damir, that we are faith-based beings. We are endowed by our Creator with a sense of a desire and need for ultimate meaning. And I believe in God, and I'm open about that. And it's weird that I even have to kind of put it out there, like, as a disclaimer,
yeah,
which actually says something about the kind of moment that we're in, where it's actually becoming less common for someone to be open about their belief in God in liberal elite circles, that one actually has to disclose it as a potential source of bias. But, if you believe in a creator, then presumably that creator endowed us with a sense or a desire to believe in him or to be closer to him, presumably, right?
Right. Well, so I mean, we have talked about this idea of Americanism as a proxy religion, also, right? I think it's to expand on that. I mean, I'm sure you agree with this, right? Is that even liberalism is a system of as an ideology,
it's a faith,
yeah,
in its own way,
in its own way, and that's I guess gets me to sort of the other thing that I want to like maybe pick at. I was just reading last week Ivan Krastev's not most recent book, but the previous one, After Europe.
Very good book.
And he's got this really good passage. I mean, it's like almost 2 sections, something like 2,000 words, where he talks about how the European Union in particular was built on the very, its bedrock is a certain set of liberal beliefs about how things are structured. And the whole thing is structured on top of that. And he points to the fact that, at the heart of the problem for the European Union right now is, on the one hand, its belief in universals. And on the other hand, the sort of stickiness of the fact that, people are not able to allow for complete movement of individuals, right? And it strikes me that it's not a perfect match on the racism stuff, but there's a kind of thing that we've lost, it seems, maybe in this, as we are feeling this vacuum you talk about and trying to fill it with something, that we inflate things beyond what they should be. Basically, in a sort of normal liberal sense, is obviously we think that people have a set of rights, and it should be, we should try to do as best we can to make sure as many of those are protected as possible. And yet, if you universalize it and take it as almost sacred holy writ, well, then you create a system that you get a lot of backlash against, because, you have taken a set of beliefs and said that they are, you can't negotiate about some of these things. So migration becomes one of these things where it's, people have a right to basically move wherever they are. And since their people are interchangeable, none of this stuff matters. And you create the situation in the European Union, where, it's getting undermined based on the sort of, really rock hard, insistence on this belief. That's a lot. I don't know. Maybe you can talk a little bit sort of to unpack that, because that's a lot.
Yeah. So there's so much good stuff in Krastev's writing on this. And there's a couple paragraphs or just sentences I want to quote that really get at something important. But we should also mention, for the benefit of our dear listeners, that you have a great piece out in the American Interest on nationalism that actually deals with some of these questions. And what's the point of having a podcast if you can't promote the work of your co-host? So I mean, we should definitely put a link for that piece, and you can maybe say a little bit more about the arguments in that piece, because it does relate to what Krastev is getting at. But so what struck me about these excerpts from Krastev's work that we had been talking about earlier over text message, he really sees the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis of 2015 as being a decisive moment in Europe's present history, if you will. And I'm actually inclined in that direction, that 2015 will be remembered as, to use a cliche, a turning point, or as a moment that shifted the way we understood politics in this particular part of the world, and that Europe will never be the same. And it feeds into something that I've written in my own work about how the presence of Muslims in Europe, the growing presence of Muslims in Europe because of the Syrian civil war and its spillover effects, will change not just the demographic nature of Europe as we know it, but the cultural and religious nature of Europe as we know it. Because the very presence of growing numbers of Muslim migrants and Muslim refugees is forcing, if you will, indigenous, if it's not a great word, locals or native European populations to contend with fundamental questions about who they are and what it means to be European and what is the nature of the European project. I don't want to always put us as Muslims at the forefront of history, that we're the ones who, even though we're a minority in Europe, somewhere between 1% and 8% in a lot of these countries. So it's not a huge number, but the fact that in some sense we're driving history is sort of a interesting idea, that we could have that outsized effect well beyond our numbers. But
what do you make of that? I mean,
well, it's, it says something about our centrality to history, and that we could actually be the ones who end up undoing the end of history.
Right. But, so what's interesting to me, right, I think where you and I differ on this is that what I'm getting at, what struck me about the Krastev, what strikes me about the
yes, Damir, I'm Muslim centric.
No. Where you and I differ is that I think you're not against universals, and what I'm, I agree with you that a hole is trying to be filled here, even though I'm not religious at all. I don't have that instinct. A hole is being filled here with this need for certainties, be it a kind of good feeling of denouncing evils like racism wherever you see it, and therefore racism, you start seeing it everywhere. The most minor offense can be categorized as something like that. Be it that, or be it this idea that you build an entire modern society on a set of values of universal. I don't want to say inclusion, but this set of universal values which you can't compromise on. It seems to me that we're suffering from a surfeit of this kind of almost, I don't know, extreme need for that kind of universal certainty. And whereas you might say, well, we need religion to fill that, and I would say, fine, I don't, but perhaps the world does. Overall, my immediate wish was that everyone just back off all of this sort of stuff. Basically, the European Union, if it wasn't so fixated on the eternal and universal truth of the values that it thinks it's built upon, and would say, well, we're trying as best we can with the migrant question, and if there's an electoral backlash, they actually are forced to do it and then don't hand-wring about it, but try and come up with pragmatic responses of how to best live the values that they claim they are. Not feel that if they're not, achieving the universal in the world, that it's a failure. I guess that's what I'm getting at. And it's tied to all of this, be it the kind of crusading moral righteousness in our public discourse that leads to, this kind of, what's it called? Virtue signaling, and denouncing, and our whole politics of social justice and the rest of this. There's a kind of narrower morality, a more wholesome thing, which is saying, we can't achieve everything. We're human. We're in a broken world, right? But we must strive for it, but striving within the limits of what's possible, not constantly getting lost in these universals, be they, the rights of the migrants that, are inviolable, or, rooting out every ill thought that is, grounded in historical injustice and expurgating it from our existence because it's evil. All of that seems to me is the problem. And my preferred solution is to somehow dial it back, though I don't know if that's possible, because maybe we're just trying to fill that hole you're talking about that's left by lack of religion. Yeah.
So a couple things. And I think that one point that you make really well in your piece that came out today, perhaps for our readers, it'll be a couple days ago. I don't know. But in any case, they should read it, because I think that you're getting at this idea that the EU, the very European project, depends on a certain set of universalist premises and a kind of progressive assumption about history's trajectory.
Yeah.
And that those assumptions did not turn out to be correct assumptions about human motivation and human nature, that there was a built-in assumption that Europeans, or people who live in Europe, because even the concept of a European is questionable, that they didn't come to develop what you say, they didn't develop quote unquote, the kind of enthusiasm for the project that its architects thought would naturally come to them with time. Your words, Damir, that they got something wrong, the architects of the EU, about what members of this European Union would feel about the European idea. They weren't able to develop this enthusiasm. They didn't believe. They didn't develop a faith.
Right.
Because that's not who we are. That's not who they are. That they're like we as human beings cannot get excited about a supranational body that is ultimately somewhat related to a somewhat unaccountable bureaucratic government in Brussels.
Right.
Like, we can't get excited about that. We're not going to get excited about that. It doesn't touch us directly. It doesn't touch British people, French people, German people in that kind of, visceral way. So something is not going to connect with people. And that's what we've realized. And Krastev makes this point in After Europe. And perhaps I'll if I can find this. Anyway, he has amazing paragraphs about this. I just got too many windows open, I guess. But he gets at this a very similar idea, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sort of deeply indebted to a lot of that stuff and how I think through it. I mean, it's just he's right on a lot of that. You know, and we can take all sorts of tangents on this, but one thing that I think is dear to your heart is the importance of the idea of politics, because let's not forget, you know, the paradox of the founding of the European Union is that it's in many ways this is oversimplifying, but on the one hand, it was an attempt to get over politics because politics were supposed to have caused all the horrors of the two wars in the interwar period. And so depoliticizing the continent was supposed to lead to peace. But at the same time, the other part of it, which they didn't really foresee and understand, is that America was another sort of model. You know, you look at America and you have a society that, at least on the surface, is committed to a document, a constitution, a set of words put down on a piece of paper by a bunch of dudes, you know, a while ago. And the emotional attachment to this thing was interpreted as, well, you know, we just need to come up with our own document that then people can have, will develop a certain kind of attachment to because it'll work and it'll show that it works. That misunderstands the American project, I think, in a fundamental way. I was writing in the essay, part of it is that, you know, you can't have an attachment to something like that without politics. That's one of the big mistakes they made, was trying to evade politics and just build attachment through positive outcomes. That's not quite right. But that then goes back to what I was saying, a related question about, on the one hand, my feeling that these kinds of enthusiasm, these kinds of attachments are potentially unhealthy. This idea to fill the void with attachment to things like the state. But at the same time, there is something about America where you do have this kind of irrational attachment to the system as it works here, because it works, because it maybe demands a certain kind of engagement and maybe civic virtue, or did in any case, that leads people to have feelings for it that Europeans just haven't developed. I don't know.
Yeah, so you've kind of touched on one of my hobby horses, and I think listeners of the podcast will know about my sort of semi-obsession with the idea of politics as conflict.
Right.
That politics is not supposed to lead to consensus or civility or unity. That actually there is such a problem as too much consensus. And actually, I should mention, and I apologize in advance for this self-promotion, but me and a colleague, Sharan Grewal, have a very long Brookings paper out about, it's titled The Dark Side of Consensus in Tunisia. We use Tunisia as a case study to argue that consensus can be detrimental to democracy because it misunderstands important aspects of what politics is and should be about, which is competition about different and conflicting ideas. And if too many people agree too much of the time, then you actually don't, then you lose the benefit of having good competing ideas. And that's what democracy is supposed to produce. But if you have big national unity governments where everyone is in the same tent, or most of the major parties are in the same tent, then you don't end up having a strong opposition. And without a strong opposition, it leads to a kind of democratic disillusion, because voters are saying, well, what is the alternative to the status quo? If everyone is advocating the status quo and is actually part of the status quo in terms of the structure of government, then there isn't a kind of corrective mechanism for what the government does or doesn't do. People can't hold the government to account. So I think that this gets to a bigger issue that, you know, if we want to apply this to the EU in some sense is about resolving the problem of politics. But the premise here is that politics is a problem to be solved.
Right. No, for sure. Yeah. No, that's right. The funny thing though, right, is that also at the same time, for conflict to be managed, you can't let any of the ideas be universal. They have to be subject to, if not compromise, at least that it's not that a sin is not being perpetrated by your opponents when they're in power. It doesn't have to be that everything leads to compromise. I think that's false. Not that democracy is a road to compromise, but it has to at least the strength of your beliefs in ideas has to allow for disagreement, and more than disagreement, the possibility of at least letting the wrong side win for a time, right? I mean, there has to be something over that.
Yeah, and at some basic level, democracy is about the right to be wrong. And if you had, let's say you had a hypothetical situation where all major parties in European countries thought the EU was just great and dandy, that would actually be in some sense contrary to a democratic spirit, because if the political is real, if there is real politics, there should be parties that are excited and enthusiastic about the EU as a project, but then there should also be parties that are less enthusiastic about the EU as a project. If you ever got to a point where all major parties in a given country were like, we love the EU, that would actually be somewhat frightening. It would not bode well for what I consider to be what's at the heart of democratic competition.
But there's something that the ideas underlying politics can't be that important at the same time. They can't be fundamentally life or death questions. If they're life or death questions...
Say a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, if they're life or death questions, I've thought about...
What do you consider to be a life or death question?
Well, so, you know, the other essay I wrote recently was this review about nationalism in Central Eastern Europe, this book by John Connolly.
We should say for our dear listeners, Damir is being just, you know, casual and rather modest, but he has been on a roll, and he has two major essays out in the past week alone.
Now you've distracted me. I don't know what I was going to say. No. So, but thank you, Shadi. No, the interesting thing about that, I sometimes think about, you know, you look at the Balkans, and it's the problem in Bosnia, for example, is that you have ethnic parties. That you don't have political parties. You do have political parties, but and there are small civic parties, but the large blocks are ethnic parties. And the issue with an ethnic party is that it votes on along ethnic lines. That means that on some level, and you'll hear this from politicians sometimes from the region, it's like, I can't do that. I can't because my people, and that's an existential question. That seems to me, it's the kind of question that once you let that into the democratic process, that your group is your party and it feels threatened. This is the thesis of that John Connolly book, that nationalism is largely grows in opposition to an other, and it's that sense of a group being threatened. If you allow that concept into a multi-party democracy and you define parties based on that, that's a problem, and you have democratic dysfunction if you allow too much of that. Now, again, I'm not a comparativist. I'm not even a political scientist. So, I mean, tell me more.
But Damir, it's a problem, but it's also, I think, if I understand your argument correctly, it's also natural. I mean, part of what you're arguing and also part of what Connolly is arguing in his book is that nationalism is a very authentic, natural, in quotation marks, expression of a need for security, that it arises naturally when people feel they have to protect themselves against external threats.
Right.
And there's nothing that's more natural than that need or that desire. And we happen to be in a time where a lot of people feel, rightly or wrongly, under threat from imagined or real forces, external or internal forces, or whatever it might be. So if we're trying to look at why right-wing nationalism and right-wing populism is rising in such diverse contexts in different regions and with different cultures and different religions, it's because there's something about the modern condition that makes people feel more vulnerable than they would otherwise feel. And nationalism speaks to that sense of vulnerability, and it gives that vulnerability a voice.
What's interesting about the 19th century is that, when you had empires and you had monarchies, liberals and nationalists were hand in hand. Liberalism and nationalism were allies. And then, by the time, certainly now, these things are seen as in opposition to each other. Because to a certain extent, you can't have a properly pluralistic liberal democracy if it allows nationalism into the party system, because it undermines the pluralistic concept. And the story of Europe, certainly Central and Eastern Europe, is one of nation states being born because of nationalism, because as empires fall apart. But the challenge that ends up being, and it's an unhappy story in the 20th century because, one empire is ultimately replaced by another, but it's that national nation states, proper nation states, they can develop parties, and parties develop along ideological lines that don't have to do with these things. But, at the same time, the real danger is one of ethnic parties, because you can't have that kind of pluralism. That's all I'm getting at. And that's what I'm saying is you have to have ideas that don't rise to the level of universals. And that's, I guess, what worries me about a lot of this virtue signaling. Again, maybe to cycle back, since we are at 1 hour already, but maybe to cycle back to the beginning. That's what worries me about a lot of this kind of very shrill posturing about, social justice, about calling out racism because it's everywhere. Not saying that there isn't racism, et cetera, et cetera.
But if racism is everywhere, then it's also nowhere.
Well, certainly. But more than that, it's that if everything is racism and racism is evil, well then, there's nothing to talk about. Do you know what I mean?
There's no way to do politics.
Exactly. You can't do politics with something that is an absolute evil. And I mean, you see that this is the discourse that we have with Trump right now and Republicans versus Democrats.
And that's why I almost, as you know, Damir, I almost never want to or am willing to use the word evil in public debate, unless there is one exception. And you can probably guess what that exception is. And I'm not even like joking right now, the Chinese regime. And I've actually said this on Twitter before, that I hesitate to ever use such strong language because it's so decisive and definitive. But when I do think about evil, I do think about the crimes and atrocities of the Chinese regime.
No, I mean, I'm not, I don't.
No, because it kind of goes back to like, because we started talking about like the Chinese regime.
No, for sure. I mean, I think we should end up there because it's an interesting question. But take all your points about legitimacy, about fragility, about their own sense of, I think, fragility, and therefore, ramping up these sorts of attacks and, this kind of rhetoric about, the wounding of the pride of the Chinese people. And it's just interesting to me that this kind of sense of illegitimacy ends up relying on something that in an unrelated way is now bedeviling us, this sort of sense of grievance.
Yeah, and also the fact that a people as a collective can have a pride in something, and how do we even speak for that collective, which goes back to a criticism we had about last episode about the Russian soul in quotation marks or Russian exceptionalism, that someone on Twitter had apparently listened to, I guess, most of the episode, and more power to them. And we're happy to have people who are willing to do that.
Yeah.
But I think that this person, we'll keep her anonymous. I think it's a her, but I could be wrong, but we'll keep him or her anonymous, was saying that there was a kind of racist aspect to what we were talking about, that there were 4 of us on the podcast, so we won't, that 1 or 2 of us was saying things about Russian characteristics, or about the Russian soul.
Right.
That was racist, and this person on Twitter was very offended. Even though, so do you have any thoughts about that? Because I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, no.
And I even said things that could be considered problematic about Egyptians, about the Egyptian soul. And one of our friends were saying something about the Russian characteristics. And these are our own, it's not, I guess it's like half my own country. It's not actually my own country, because my own country is America. But because my parents are from Egypt, I do feel a kind of personal connection to conversations about what Egyptian identity actually is. And one of our Russian guests who joined us, she's Russian, and she was talking about what Russia means to her. And she has every right to talk about her own identity and how she perceives it, right?
I mean, what annoyed me about that in general is that, if we are to heed this dictum to not do what we did last time, I think I'd feel poorer for it.
No, but we would be silent. We wouldn't be able to speak.
Ultimately, I mean, on the sort of,
if you take it to its logical conclusion that we can't, like, even people who are of their own nations can't actually speak about what it means to be who we are. Like, Americans can't talk about like what does it mean to be American? Russians can't talk about, even if it's negative, what it means to be Russian. And that can be, it doesn't always have to be positive, especially if you have a history that's as tragic as Russian history actually is, or as Egyptian history actually is.
Yeah, it's deeply preposterous. I mean, I've really tried to parse my words carefully in this podcast, but and I've tried to be careful on Twitter when talking about this stuff. No, I mean, it's not good. And my instinct is, when people come at me with this stuff, is to just ignore them. The striking thing about this episode and watching it unfold with Walter has been that you have a massive state apparatus that is cynically playing this, and you can't just blow it off. It has a lot of knock-on effects right now, and this nonsense attitude among us, this self-righteous universal bullshit, is now, is being cynically manipulated for that.
Yeah,
That's
and look,
it.
and Damir, you say that, sometimes you have to let it go and ignore it, but me and you, Damir, we are small people in the broader sweep of history, but some intellectual fights have to be fought.
Yeah.
And at some point you have to say, hey, this is not going to benefit me. This is not going to make me new friends, but this is absurd. It's preposterous, as you said. And some things have to be opposed and countered, and we have to do so without apology.
No, that's right. That's right. I mean, again, balancing it without, being careful, in the sense that one should not gratuitously, go after people. I think that's one way that, in fact, the sort of anti-PC right and all that's just ends up being a circus of like giving offense.
Wasn't it Mitt Romney who actually wrote a book that was titled, I think, No Apology?
I don't know. Is that right?
You clearly don't read Mitt Romney's wonderful books.
I've ordered the entire after he's proven himself to be an American hero. Anyway, Shadi, thanks. This was fun.
This is great. Thanks, Damir.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.